I have two guests here today. It's Sandi Adams and Teresa Tannahill. And Sandi, could you start us off by telling us a little bit about yourself?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I used to work in the corporate world many, many years ago. And I found myself working for big corporations like Microsoft and Google. And I realized there was something deeper going on. And I've always been I've had a very inquiring mind. And I realized that there was more going on. And I began to look at the United Nations. I don't know why I did, but I did. And about Agenda 21, which was, really brought about in 1992 at the Earth Summit. And in the end, I left the corporate world. I couldn't deal with it anymore. And I spent a lot of time researching. I did other things for work and gave up a big career. But I just wanted to really get to the bottom of what's going on. And all my fears have been sort of, have been confirmed really with what's happening right now, what's happened in particularly the last 3 to 4 years. So, it's my sort of, I know, it's not a belief, I know that the United Nations are really trying to gain global control of just about everything, every resource on our planet. And this was kind of put into action during the Earth Summit in 1992, where they got 178 countries to sign up to global governance. Not many people know this. Not many people realize that in September 1992, with the blessing of then King Charles, the Prince of Wales, who had his Royal Yacht Britannia in the harbour of Rio de Janeiro harbour, they put together a plan, and it was to literally own every resource on our planet, and to get 178 countries to sign up to Agenda 2030, 21 it was then, the agenda for the 21st century, to save the planet. And it was just to save the planet. And they coerced all these leaders, these world leaders, to sign up because they said the planet's dying and we've got to save it. And we know now that that was a big fat lie, and they've used it to really bring about this entire straitjacket over our entire planet. So that's my story.
Okay. And actually, you came to prominence kind of for me in March of 23, right? You did this.
That was so funny because I've been on this since, 2009 and before. And in 2023, the 15-minute cities kicked off. So I was asked to speak at my local town council, and I had no idea I was being filmed. No idea whatsoever. They film town councils now, and you only have like 3 minutes with an egg timer to speak. And I spoke, but I didn't leave it there. I kind of just went on, and they listened. It was 15 or 20 years of frustration really came out, and I didn't realize, but it went viral. I mean, it's had something like 10 million views now all over the world. And it was kind of launched me back into the spotlight. And, since then I've held a big sort of great net zero debate, and I've made a documentary with Mark Sharman from Oracle Films, and I'm writing a book. So yeah, it was a strange thing but it was almost like a poke. Come on, Sandi, get it together. You've got to get on it again.
Yeah, so it's brilliant stuff. I'm going to I have a link to it in the show description so people can watch it. But that was kind of off the cuff, huh? You just studied this stuff for so long.
I hadn't a clue what I was going to say. It wasn't scripted. It was literally years and years of research just came out in a big kind of, word salad, really.
So
it was extraordinary.
What sort of feedback did you get after it went viral then?
I got, actually, the town council were furious. They were, my town council is sadly, the mayor is in Extinction Rebellion, Just Stop Oil, Earth First. I couldn't have a worse town council, and they have pinned me as enemy number one to the town. So I have quite a difficult job here. But the rest of the world loved it. It turned up in all sorts of documentaries. There's a lady called Suzanne Edwards who did a very good one from New Zealand, and she put that right in the center of the documentary because they're dealing with managed retreat in New Zealand now, which is another faction of Agenda 21, which is, evacuate all coastal areas, for, because it's all going to, sea level rise, it's a load of rubbish. Yeah. Anyway.
Very interesting. Are we ready for Teresa yet for an introduction of Teresa?
Yes. Yeah, sure.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so I studied a degree in physics back in the 1980s. I graduated in 1990. Pretty much shelved it until 2020. I really thought that everything I could remember about my degree could fit on the back of a postage stamp. So I was quite surprised actually with the events of 2020, but I wasn't in some ways. During 2008, I figured out how the world works. I think that was my first wake-up call, and I realized who's running the world, about the banks, the fractional reserve banking, and the way that the banking system works. And then in 2020, I heard whispers in January that there was a novel coronavirus circulating. By February, I figured out pretty much that it was going to be used to pretty much vaccinate the entire world. And by March, April, when we went into the lockdowns, I realized that the lockdowns pretty much looked like a hard implementation of United Nations Agenda 21, which I had been aware of over the preceding years. So I sat down with all 351 pages of Agenda 21 and I read it cover to cover. And I have to say, it was the most boring and the most frightening document that I have ever seen. It was all about inventory of control and control of every resource on the planet. And it was frightening in its scope because I realized that it was everything, even down to the human beings, every life, every animal, every plant, everything, every body of water. The whole thing was being catalogued. And in April, I noticed that some of the lockdown measures for social distancing seemed very strange indeed. I mean, they were telling us that there was going to be a vaccine coming, and yet all of the changes to the road layouts, widening pavements, which is the sidewalk here in the UK, they were all permanent. So why would they make these changes permanent and even begin in April 2020 when we hardly knew anything about what was going to hit us? Why were these changes permanent if there was a vaccine coming and life was going to go back to normal? And I realized that life wasn't going to go back to normal. Glasgow lost a third of its parking spaces overnight with what they were doing. And so I started Googling and I was looking through all the search engine results. And if you just put in traffic layout changes with social distancing, all of the towns and cities in Britain were coming up. It was just page after page after page, all of them. Doncaster, even down to some small towns in remote places like Cornwall, they all suddenly had to change the road layouts. And I thought, this is crazy. So I started looking online in other countries, the United States, Europe, and throughout the Western world, I could see that these changes were being implemented worldwide, all to accommodate social distancing. And that was bizarre. And as 2020 progressed, and we saw the attacks on our food supply, for example, migrant workers not being permitted to fly, Tyson meat processing being shut down in the United States. There were pleas for help from ranchers on YouTube saying that the FDA had come in and told them because COVID, they had to slaughter their herds and their flocks. One guy actually said that during 2020, the United States became a net importer of beef from Namibia, of all places. And it was looking as though it was a hard implementation of the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals, which were accelerated from Agenda 21, I believe, to Agenda 2030. Sandi would know more about that. But I started tracking it, and in the end, by late 2020, I just gave up. It was overwhelming. And I started to think about, well, why are they doing this? What is the purpose of putting us through almost like this regimented frog march into a totally new way of life. And eventually it occurred to me that the goals of United Nations Agenda 21, Agenda 2030, aligned very strongly with the probability that they were expecting some kind of natural catastrophe. And this is where I started reaching out to Sandi, because I knew that she was our expert on Agenda 21, Agenda 2030. And Sandi and I got our heads together and we started looking at it, and it was terrifying. So that's my introduction. Where should we go from there now? Should we go back to Sandi, or?
Let's do that. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, this has been, I mean, I'm only looking, because I'm not a scientist, you see, but I can see how well these, what's happening now and the way it's been accelerated could fit in, because Klaus Schwab is always talking about a cyber attack. I mean, he mentioned that in the Rockefeller, the Rockefeller documents of 2010, there's one called Hack Attack. There was Lockstep, which we've experienced. And there's several others in the Rockefeller document of 2010, which is the strategic, can't remember what it's called now, but it's the Rockefeller document, the Lockstep document of 2010. It's called the Document of Future Technologies or something like that. And they talk about a cyber attack in that, where we're reduced to literally living almost like the whole world to a third world country. And I suddenly thought, are they actually, because the way that they operate is they tell you everything. Is it that they're telling us something? Are they telling us that there is going to be a cyber attack? But when you look at the earth changes that are happening now, that Teresa and Dr. Valentina Zarkova and various other really soon, all of these scientists are beginning to not worry, but they're concerned about the weakening of the Earth's magnetic field. Now, the Agenda 21 has been a very long-term operation. They look years and years and years in advance. And this really, you can look at the energy-based economy going right back to the 1930s. And Patrick Wood's brilliant on this with the Technocracy movement. And I did study a lot of his work and others, and found that, it goes back a long way, where they tried to implement an energy-based economy in the 1930s. And there were two scientists, or political scientists. One was an engineer, one was a political scientist. It was M.K. Hubbard and Howard Scott. And they operated out of Columbia University, which has been a hotbed of technocracy thinking, actually, even up until now. Klaus Schwab, George Soros, they've all been involved with Columbia. And they devised this way of changing the economy and changing the political system to an energy-based economy, and more of I should say a communitarian system of politics, where the rights of the community outweigh the rights of the individual. And they tried to do this, but it failed. It failed in the 1930s simply because people weren't ready to get rid of conservative thinking and capitalism. And it was just before the Second World War, so it just fizzled out. And weirdly, Elon Musk's grandfather was involved in it. He had a political party called the Social Credit Party. I mean, you couldn't believe it, where everything was based on social credits, and that everything was calculated on the energy that any product took to produce. So they were really trying hard to push that. So it didn't work, but it was reborn in the 1970s by Zbigniew Brzezinski. And he wrote a book called America's Role in the Technocratic Age. And this whole thing re-emerged globally with different leaders, mainly ones that had done Klaus Schwab's Global Leaders Training. And it all sort of started bubbling up to the surface again. And it's been a concerted effort since then, since the Earth Summit. So there were three major Club of Rome reports. Club of Rome instrumental in all this, and Professor Nordengard talks about this as well. The Club of Rome was instrumental in being the United Nations think tank to bring about global governance. And in the 1960s, it was put together. I mean, the Club of Rome was 1968. It started in 1968 with Aurelio Peccei. And they came up with all sorts of ideas of how they could create this global governance. And it was really in 3 Club of Rome reports. The very first one was called this one, Limits to Growth. This was all about depopulation and population control. And it went a very deep dive into the world's too many people, not enough resources, got to do something about it. And then the second one was called Our Common Future. This was 1981 and 1987, I beg your pardon, 1987. This was a communitarian Marshall Plan, really, to distribute money evenly across the globe. It was called the Frontman report, which Prince Charles, or King Charles now, really sings the praises of. It's totally Marxist, it was a Marshall Plan that took certainly all the UK's industry over to India and China. And that was meant to be, they had to literally hollow the UK out from inside out, and America as well. And so a lot of everything went over to India and China, who were pushing out masses of emissions, whereas Europe hardly anything, and we're being sanctioned. So this is what happened really at the climate conference in 2015 in Paris, where Trump walked out. He said, "I've had enough of this," and he walked out because of the emissions problem. And then the very last one, and I've lost the cover to this one, unfortunately, but it's called The First Global Revolution. Now, this one was really interesting because this one heralded the beginning of climate change. And this is how they did it. And I'm going to read a quote because it's all about finding enemies to unite people under a common crisis. The need for enemies seems to be a common historical factor. States have striven to overcome domestic failure and internal contradictions by designating external enemies. The scapegoat practice is as old as mankind itself. When things become too difficult at home, divert attention by adventure abroad. Bring the divided nation together to face an outside enemy, either a real one or else one invented for the purpose. Now, that's interesting. And then they found the enemy that they needed on this page. This is the common enemy of man. In searching for a new enemy to unite us, we came up with the idea that pollution, the threat of global warming, water shortages, famine, and the like would fit the bill. All these dangers are caused by human intervention, and it's only through changed attitudes and behavior that they can be overcome. The real enemy then is humanity itself. So in 1991, they designated us as the enemy, and that is why we're in the mess we're in. And actually, after the Earth Summit, which came in 1992, they published this. Now, Teresa was talking about the control and inventory. Now, I've got a copy of this book. See how big it is? And this is an inventory of every single thing on our planet and how it's going to be managed and how it's going to be controlled. And in this is the Wildlands Project of America on page 992. And you probably know about that. The big map of America, North America, which is all red and yellow with the little smart cities dotted around. And all the corridors in between are only military and federal use. Well, that is in here on page 992. So this was the plan. The plan was that humans have destroyed the planet. Therefore, we have to be locked up in our smart cities and data harvested and just about everything else. I read Rosa Koren's book in, I think it was when she brought it out in 2010. And I suddenly, all the jigsaw fitted together. And I realized, and I actually got to know her, sadly she passed away, and also Nikki Rapana and Nordica Friedrich about communitarianism, because that is a massive tool of they're using that now, of putting everything into communities, which could then be controlled by the corporations. So we've got to be very careful about community-based initiatives, because often they're infiltrated. It's been a hard slog. And now, of course, we've got farming in absolute, mess, certainly in the UK, Holland, throughout Europe and America as well, I'm sure. So we've got a big problem on our hands. And when you think that they're pushing constantly for us to go over to electric, everything electric, well, how convenient. I mean, when you look at the Absolute Zero report, the UK Fires report, which I must get you, probably put it into the chat or something. It's a report which has a roadmap to 2050 and beyond, and how there's to be nothing electric after 2030, that everything there'll be no flying in or out of the UK after 2049, no imports, no exports, all wood-burning stoves to be got rid of, all gas boilers to be pulled out of every home in the UK. So they don't want us having autonomous means of heating, lighting, or warmth or anything. And it all has to be put onto electric. Well, how convenient would that be to actually be able to control the human population and starve us out? If there was a cyber attack or a Carrington event, the electricity grid would go, and we would literally be completely, we wouldn't have any autonomy of anything. So this is where I began to look at what Teresa was saying, and thought, well, maybe there is something in this. What is going on here? I have spoken to other scientists who don't agree, but it's good to chuck this around and get people's opinion, and maybe get other scientists maybe involved who might have an opinion on this, because I think it's a really important one.
Teresa, do you have anything to add there?
Oh gosh, yes.
That's it.
Okay, well, as a child of the 1970s, I remember, well, maybe I just have a false memory there, but I remember something about it being very cold. I was only little, but I remember we had some very harsh winters. And my dad would tell me about the winter of 1947, when apparently the snow was over the roof of the houses. And on their farm, their horses were found, some of them were found dead on their feet, frozen solid. And he remembers clearly his grandfather out in the backyard shooting crows to feed them. So it was harsh. So compared to that, the harsh winters of the 1970s and 1980s particularly, that I remember were nothing really in comparison, but they were still much colder than they are today. So I remember that the BBC thought that we were going to go into a new ice age. I believe it was the cover of the Radio Times magazine. And Leonard Nimoy was in a documentary, wasn't he? That's right, saying that we could be heading into a new ice age. And then suddenly in the 1980s, it was all about the ozone hole. Do you remember that? We all gave up hairspray and aerosols and deodorants, and well, wow, we managed to fix it, except that I think that the ozone hole is bigger than it ever was. And I think that they're not going to tell us much about that, because they can't. I mean, what are they going to say? What are they going to blame it on this time? And then we had the global warming narrative going through the 90s, except the Earth wasn't playing ball, so it switched to climate change. And now, as you know, we've got the carbon dioxide debacle, which is absolutely ridiculous. And because people are starting to see the holes in that, they're talking about methane. I mean, literally cow burps and farts. This is just crazy. So I started looking at the reasons why they might be doing this hard implementation of United Nations Agenda 21. And, well, it looks to me as though they are expecting a Carrington event. Now, I don't know if all of your viewers know what a Carrington event was, but I can quickly recap it. A Carrington event it's named after the astronomer Richard Carrington, who in 1859 noticed a very powerful flare on the sun as he was sketching sunspots. And the flare appeared to come from one of the more complex sunspot groups. He was amazed. He ran to fetch a witness, but by the time he got back, it had stopped. Now, in the days prior to his observation, there had been aurora borealis lighting up practically the whole world. And within a few hours of his observation, whilst he was no doubt still writing up his report for the Royal Astronomical Society, the aurora borealis hit once again. Now, later on, 2 and 2 were put together and to make 4, and it was realized that the solar flare that he observed had sent out some kind of a coronal mass ejection, which had triggered that aurora. And so the event was named after him. Now, back in those days, we had really a fledgling electrical industry. We didn't really have the infrastructure, the power grid that we have now. It was purely being used for the telegram system. And as you probably already know, there were meltdowns, the jolt, the electromagnetic jolt, surged electric currents through all the telegraph wires, causing them to melt down to Earth. Some telegraph operators were electrocuted at their posts. I hope they were okay. But pretty soon they discovered that if they quickly disconnected the battery, they could still continue to send telegrams from city to city without even having a battery connected, due to the strength of the current that was induced in the wire because of the electromagnetic pulse. Now, we haven't had a Carrington level solar flare since then that has actually been aimed towards Earth. In 2012, one did fire off that missed the Earth by 9 days. And in 2023, in March, there was another solar flare that emitted a full spectrum a full halo CME that thankfully targeted Mercury. It didn't come our way at all. But it's thought that if one was to happen now, it could pretty much knock out the grid worldwide. And I started to think, well, is it possible that this is what they are expecting? Because if you look at the goals of United Nations Agenda 21, it's all about forcing us to be dependent on that grid. And not just that, but to taper us off fossil fuels to the point where if the grid was to go down, we would not be able to restart civilization. If you picture it, within minutes of the Carrington event CME hitting the Earth, you would see the grid go down, probably worldwide. You would see an end of refrigeration, transport. You wouldn't have the availability of fuel. A lot of vehicles wouldn't work. Our solar panel farms would be basically fried. You wouldn't get wind turbines working because they require electricity to get them moving. We would be pretty much knocked back into pre-industrial times, and it may even be worse than that. Because having used all the low-hanging fruit over the last couple of 100 years, we would find it very difficult to start again. If you imagine that there's no electricity available, you've got no water being pumped, no water purification, you've got no sewage treatment. Our towns and cities, particularly the larger towns and cities, will become basically death traps. Within a few hours, you would see the food in the refrigerated and frozen storage start to spoil. I know that our supermarkets have something like 3 days' food on hand because they use a just-in-time distribution method. And pretty much within a few days, I think you would see some very harrowing scenes where people would be literally fighting over food. And obviously, some of them would want to try and escape the cities to go out to the countryside. But if the United Nations succeeds, and the World Economic Forum, if they succeed in implementing the net carbon zero goals of Agenda 2030, it's game over. Because if you think about it, they're trying to get rid of our farmland, our livestock. They don't want us to eat meat anymore. They don't want us to have access to non-GMO seeds. And remember, you have to go back and buy those seeds from the manufacturers each year. In fact, in Britain, there's a tax if you want to use your own seeds. A wheat farmer friend has told me that there's a tax that you have to pay to use your own seeds. So our trees are being chopped down and burnt here in the UK for biomass, and I'm sure that this is going on all around the world. Saplings are being planted, which will have absolutely no utility whatsoever. So if you think about it, if they achieve their goals and all of the oil pipelines are shut down, the gas pipelines are shut down, everybody's running off of solar. The farmers have basically stopped farming. We're eating food grown hydroponically in factory farms. We're eating insects, which will be grown in insect farms, which are all heavily dependent on electricity. You need that in hydroponics because you're pretty much growing indoors and you're going to need the lighting and the heating. The same with insects. All of these highly intensive and kind of artificial food production methods are totally dependent on the grid. So if you imagine in the aftermath of a Carrington event, people stumbling out from the cities to the rewilded countryside to find that all the crops are gone or they're GMO and they're not going to come back. All the livestock is gone because we don't eat meat anymore. So there's no way of converting the grass into protein. All the trees have been chopped down for biomass. All the land that was previously arable has been planted with saplings, which will have no utility for decades. The land is carpeted with solar panels, which will have burnt out, fried. People will be desperate. They will eat everything in their path, like locusts, and they will exacerbate their plight because they will eat the seed crop if they can find it. They will eat any livestock. They won't be thinking about the future. They will just eat anything in their path. And I do believe that if things get bad enough, they will actually start turning on each other. And you could see cannibalism in Europe or North America. So I consider that the goals of United Nations Agenda 21 are to set humanity up to fail a Carrington event that they believe is coming. Now, I can go into the science of that as well, but I'd like to pause there for a second and see what you think of what I've just said, because I haven't heard anybody talking about this.
Do you have any sense as to what the probability is of a Carrington event in the next 20 years? Is it 1%, 10%?
I reviewed 7 papers dealing with the Carrington event and 1 paper dealing with the Miyake event. And they're all from the last couple of decades, and they tend to predict a probability in any given decade, most of them. And the predictions are anything between like 1% and 12%. So I've gone with a conservative 10% for my prediction. I believe that with the Earth's magnetic field weakening as it is, and I can go into the reasons for that, I believe that we are looking at a 10% minimum chance of a Carrington event in this solar maximum, which is the 2025 solar maximum. 10% chance of the entire grid going down, civilization being knocked back into pre-industrial times, if not Stone Age. And by the next solar maximum, which is in roughly mid-2030s, 2036, I would say that the chances could be as much as 50-50 because of the rate at which Earth's magnetic field is weakening. Shall I go into that?
In a minute, but maybe you will be going into what are the most important things we can do to be prepared in case it does happen? Or maybe you're going to go through that?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Pretty much everything that our governments and the United Nations and the World Economic Forum are telling us that we have to do to meet the net carbon zero goals, do the opposite. That's the only way we're going to get through it. We have to fight to keep fossil fuels. We have to fight to be allowed to keep our livestock and our traditional ways of farming. Instead of highly intensive insect farms and fake meat labs, we need to go back to a traditional old-fashioned way of farming. It's the only way we're going to survive. We're going to need to stop them from culling our herds. We're going to have to stop them using mRNA vaccines in our livestock. We're going to have to stop them from vilifying the eating of eggs and meat. And we're going to have to go back to heritage or heirloom seeds. We can't be using these GMO seeds because they are setting us up to fail. There'll be no way that we can recover and grow the crops that we need to grow to feed the populations if we are using GMO seeds, because where is Monsanto going to be? They're not going to be selling us the seeds. They're going to be gone.
And also keep our wood burning stoves, our open fires, and gas, LPG gas. They're trying to phase that out as well. I mean, all sorts of means of keeping warm and keeping, having a means to cook and keep warm. I think we've really, and I think we've got to oppose all this stuff anyway, because it is destroying our economies, irregardless of whether the Carrington event happens. We have to be rejecting all the stuff that they're throwing at us, particularly our farmers. And I get very frustrated with British farmers because, there's a handful of them really that have stood up to this. But over the next 3 years, they're getting their subsidies phased out. And they have to diversify. They have to put solar panels in their fields, wind farms, housing, anything but growing food. And certainly they've got to phase out their livestock. Sheep and cows have to go. In Britain at least, they're trying to phase out all livestock, which is predominantly beef and lamb here. So, it leaves us so vulnerable. It really does leave us vulnerable. I've been campaigning with farmers, but I found it very difficult because so many of them are still caught up on this whole climate change nonsense. They're going along with it because they've been drip-fed subsidies for years and years and years. And they got used to it. And they're now whining that their subsidies are being taken away over the next 3 years because they've got this, they've got to diversify and set up alternative businesses on their land that is nothing to do with farming, most of it. I mean, it's ludicrous. So we've got to get our farming back. I'm working with politicians at the moment, trying to get this sorted, because this is madness, absolute madness.
Do either of you think that there are rich folk that have extensive bunkers? You hear stories of them having bunkers to be prepared for something bad happening. Is there truth to that or no?
I believe that, certainly. I mean, I do believe they've got underground bunkers. You see, the trouble is that these people, these billionaires, they think they're gods and they think they're above everyone else. And they do. I mean, they can launch themselves into space, they reckon, and stay in space until the Earth's settled down a bit, if there is going to be any kind of Earth changes. And they've got bunkers where they can go and live quite happily for quite a few months or even years, I think. So I think they've got it sorted. They don't want to compete with 8 billion useless eaters on the planet, basically.
And is a Carrington event, is that just one of many bad things that could happen? I don't know if there's a list of things. A cyber attack could take everything down, or what do you think, Teresa, or either one of you?
Well, yes, I think there are a list of things. We knew in the year 2000, according to NASA and European Space Agency records, that Earth's magnetic field over the previous 150 years had declined in strength by 10%. So by the year 2000, it was functioning at 90% of the strength that it functioned during the Carrington event. Some believe that was when the Earth's magnetic field's weakening started to accelerate in 1859. Obviously, a 10% drop in Earth's magnetic field is really significant because we rely on that to protect us, the biosphere, from solar and cosmic radiation. So the European Space Agency began to develop a set of satellites called swarm satellites. They were 3 probes that were launched in 2013 to monitor Earth's weakening magnetic field. In 2014, the European Space Agency gave a press release. I believe it was their mission director, Rune Floberhagen. And he said that Earth's magnetic field was now 15% weaker than it had been in 1859, and it was dropping at 5% per decade. And then he really let the cat out of the bag, because he said, and I quote, he said, "It looks like the poles are getting ready to flip." Now, we didn't hear from him again. And since 2014, we haven't heard a peep from the European Space Agency. And I believe that the Chinese are now concerned, because in November 2023, they launched their own probes to monitor Earth's weakening magnetic field. And I doubt we're going to get any data from them. So it does appear that this is a priority for these agencies, and it's a priority for our governments. And I believe that they are aware that the Earth's magnetic field is weakening quite seriously. Now, even if it was falling linearly, if it's 15% down in 2014, 2013, if it's 15% down then and falling at 5% per decade, well, just if it's falling linearly, it's 20% down now. Now, we know that there have been a series of accelerations in the speed at which Earth's magnetic field is decreasing. There was an interesting paper, I don't have it to hand, but I can give it to you for the show notes, that showed that there was even an acceleration last year. So we don't really know how weak it is. I suspect that our governments do know. But in any case, if you work on the presumption that, just by dead reckoning, it's 20% down, that's quite alarming. Now, I've been tracking Aurora Borealis, which is one sign of Earth's magnetic field weakening, throughout 2023. Here in the UK, Aurora Borealis was visible no less than 8 times. We've already seen it 3 times in 2024. Most recently, that geomagnetic storm that occurred last weekend, which it wasn't a particularly strong flare. I think there was a cannibal series of CMEs which basically arrived at Earth together, but it still should not have caused the light show that we saw. I was out in my backyard photographing the aurora. It was quite stunning, and it was seen at very low latitudes, and that in itself is alarming. So I've got no doubt that as we progress towards the 2025 solar maximum, that we are going to see more and more Aurora Borealis. And it's kind of like, I'm not really sure how I feel about this, but I believe that it would be better for humanity if we had the Carrington event now than if we have it in the mid-2030s. Because at the rate Earth's magnetic field is weakening, I would say that, we will be at something like 60%, maybe even lower magnetic field strength by the mid-2030s. And I think that the chances of a Carrington level event would be easily 50-50. But the problem is that if we don't have it until then, it means that the World Economic Forum and the United Nations have had us in their grip for another decade, which means that they will have an opportunity to actually get us to net zero carbon, which means that we will probably have to give up all access to fossil fuels and cars, autonomy, freedoms. It looks like they would really like to rewild the countryside, move us all into these smart cities, but they're running out of time. And I think Sandi made a very good point about that with the C40.
Yeah, with the C40 cities. I mean, when I first really started getting into Agenda 21, as it was before it turned into 2030 and 2015, the whole idea was they had the Smart City Index, globally, and they had certain cities that were allocated to be smart cities. And one of my local cities, Bristol, was to be the flagship smart city of Europe. But these cities, I mean, they keep failing, and that's the good thing about all of this, is that they set themselves these goals and the goals fail. And I believe that the smart city agenda didn't happen. And what they decided to do was create the C40 cities. And do look at the C40 cities documents online, because it really is a form of getting cities to work autonomously globally for the UN agenda and for the WF agenda. And yet they say they're not linked to either. But the rollout is exactly the same, and it's run by the smart city mayors. But what they did was they more or less said, right, we can't get these major smart cities, the infrastructure done quick enough. Let's just lock them up where they are. And that's what the C40 cities is all about. It's about literally locking up cities and using in smaller places like villages and smaller towns. You've got low traffic neighborhoods, and the smart cities are geared up for us to have, or the 15-minute cities are geared up for us to have climate lockdowns. And they'll use any excuse to lock us up in and geofence us into our own locality. And that's what's happening, is that the geofencing is coming in. This is why we've got all the infrastructure going in, because they can geofence you in your own locality where you don't see the fence, but nothing will work. Your car won't work past a certain perimeter, and your phone won't work past a certain perimeter. And so you're kind of locked in an invisible prison. And this is unfortunately what's happening in the UK with the 15-minute city lockdowns and the implementation of all the infrastructure that's gone into big cities like Oxford, Cambridge, London. You know, they're all 15-minute cities, and we've just got to realise that all this infrastructure actually went in while we were locked down. You know, while we were sleeping. Most of the infrastructure went in. The biometrics went into the supermarkets for the facial recognition, the digital ID. The surveillance cameras went up for the number plate recognition for the 15-minute cities. And the revenue that they're getting from that is enormous. And it's getting worse. And now we've got Sadiq Khan has been re-elected to be the mayor of London to literally bring this into fruition. And what we have to remember is that in the beginning, when an Agenda 21 was implemented, they had 8 goals to be implemented by 2000, by the year 2000. They failed. They were called the 8 Millennium Goals. They failed. And then they then had to accelerate it. In 2015, they created the 17 goals of Agenda 2030 to be implemented by 2030. And that's what they're working on now. Now, they failed at that. It wasn't moving fast enough. So what did they do? Even we had Greta Thunberg wagging her finger at us, saying, you've got to do this, that, and the other by a certain date. And we've got to get rid of cars, we've got to stop flying. And that didn't work. So what they did, they held the Strategic Framework Partnership meeting in Geneva to accelerate the 17 goals of Agenda 21. And they did. They put it all together and how they were going to do it. And then in about 4 months later, this is in 2019, they held that meeting with Antonio Guterres from the United Nations, with Klaus Schwab, the WEF. They held the meeting in Geneva, Strategic Framework Partnership meeting. And then literally 4 months later, they had the same meeting in New York with, but added into the mix is Bill and Melinda Gates. And the rest is history. They used the lockdown to accelerate Agenda 2030. And that's acceleration, I believe, with Teresa's information, is to literally keep accelerating it because everything is accelerating in nature. They know this. They know it.
Well, I want to just throw in one thing about this C40 cities document. I just pulled it up here again. Their ambitious target for 2030 is 0 kilograms of meat consumption per person per year, 0 kilograms of dairy consumption per person, and 2,500 calories per person per day. So they're going to try to restrict our caloric.
They call this the planetary diet, and it's worldwide. It's global. They want us eating, literally, it's a rationing. It's like going back to the war. It's a rationing, and they don't really want anybody eating meat and dairy. They're going to try and phase that out. And if you look at the Planetary diet, they want to use jellyfish products and crickets and all sorts of bugs and weird stuff. Nobody wants to eat that. I don't think we can process it either.
Yeah. So here's what I'm saying is there's no way they're going to shove this down our throats. Absolutely not. People are not going to roll over and say, okay, I'm not going to eat meat ever because it's going to prevent bad weather. So I think they've way overplayed their hand. And I do see some optimism that none of this is going to fly, or they're going to try, but it's not going to fly. What do you think?
I believe that, I honestly believe that if they try again, I mean, they are also sort of trying to concoct new viruses. We've got disease X, we've got, they tried monkeypox, that didn't work. I don't think people are going to buy this now. I really don't. And I think people en masse will actually stand up, please, and say, no, we do not comply to this. We've got the pandemic treaty being signed this week in Geneva. Are we going to allow them to lock us up again? No. We've just got to say no, because all this is done on our compliance. We none of this is actually lawful. We just have to say no, and it's very easy. But we believe that they have authority over us. That's the problem. It's a bit like the Wizard of Oz, isn't it? It's just, when Dorothy pulls back the curtain, or Toto, you realize that this is all done because we believe that they're in charge, and they're not.
So maybe an important point, though, is that all of us have to fight back hard instead of sitting back and thinking it's not going to happen anyway. We don't have to fight back, because if we don't fight back, then they will shove it down our throats.
Yeah, absolutely.
Teresa, did you have more to add?
Well, yeah. I'm not as optimistic as Sandi, because I know that our government does want to go cashless, and unfortunately, once we've gone cashless, as will probably most of the rest of the world, your ability to say no, your ability to decide what you're going to spend your money on is going to be extremely difficult. I mean, it's going to be curtailed. So I see them, they're felling our mature forests, they're planting our farmland with saplings, they're banning oil, banning coal, natural gas, natural firewood. There are bans here in the UK coming in on that. In countries where they burn peat turf, that's now becoming illegal. Petrol, gasoline, diesel, banning plastics. We make plastics out of oil. They're banning plastics because they're trying to taper down our oil supply to nothing. And once they've done that, they can shut down the oil rigs, they can shut down the pipelines, they'll shut down the coal seams, there'll be no access. So it's not a question of if, it's when the Carrington event hits. We're going to find it very, very difficult. And if you look at the circumstantial evidence around what they're doing, destroying our knowledge base, everything's now subscription models. They're closing down the libraries. Everybody's buying stuff as an e-book. They're dumbing down our education. They're teaching the kids to have short attention spans. Universities are having to run catch-up classes for kids that didn't learn the stuff that they need to learn at school to be able to deal with a university level degree. You can see a whole bunch of measures that they're taking that if you add them all together, it really does look like the United Nations Agenda 21, Agenda 2030, and the World Economic Forum's Great Reset. The whole idea of it is to leverage this natural catastrophe, and I haven't really gone into what that might entail, but to leverage it to ensure that the loss of life will be maximized. There are FEMA papers, and other countries have done reports on what the potential the potential death toll could be from a Carrington event, and it is scary. I mean, it's anything up to 60, 70, 80% of the population could die. But if they succeed in getting us to net carbon zero, that that death toll could be 95%, if not higher. And I believe that they are going to push and push and push for this. So we need to we need to tell the farmers that this push to stop the traditional methods of farming, they're not fighting for their livelihoods, they're fighting for their lives. And they need to understand that.
I do believe, though, with every acceleration that they're pushing, more and more people are waking up to the truth of what really is behind this, because it's anti-human, it's anti-nature, and even the very concept of absolute zero, which that document is, the UK Fire's absolute zero document, which went through the House, House of Commons, House of Lords, to be put into immediate implementation. It's in Hansard. That was commissioned by our UK government, by Cambridge, Oxford, and a number of other top universities. Even the concept of absolute zero means nothing will grow. We know that CO2 is the gas of life. Without CO2, nature doesn't grow. I mean, farmers put CO2 into their greenhouses to make tomatoes grow. So the whole concept is anti-human and anti-nature, and that has to be called out. And the fact is that we are human beings and we are creative, and we find ways around things. I mean, even to the point where the technology, they rely on the technology, that can be taken down. And I don't want to incite, obviously, sort of anarchy. But the fact is that if things get bad enough and they continue this, we are many, they are few. And I think this is humanity's challenge right now, to oppose it and to turn it around. And that's my belief, only because I believe in the human condition, and that we will not let the human condition disappear, because that's what they want. Yeah.
And does this whole agenda rest on this anthropogenic global warming, climate change? And if people don't believe in that, the whole thing fails? Or will they just switch it out for some other fear if people are wise to that one?
Well, they've used this one for a long time. I mean, since 1992, really. And they're still pushing it now. I mean, our British Broadcasting Corporation, the BBC, is an absolute joke. They talk about it all the time, and the propaganda is unbelievable. So a lot of people are just going with alternative broadcasting now, because if it would fall apart, I think, to a degree. But they could just invent something else. Yeah, you're right. They'll do anything to gain dominion over this planet. Anything.
Yeah, could I just add to that?
Yeah.
I believe that what they're going to do is they're going to try and dupe us into believing that there's some dystopian future. Everybody needs to believe in something. And this happy, clappy green agenda where everybody's got a wind turbine in the backyard and everybody's got an electric car on the driveway and everybody's got solar panels on the roof. Well, that's the fairy tale. That's the one that's gonna grab the attention of those people who are naturally optimistic, and then people like me who are naturally pessimistic will gravitate towards the dystopian future where we're all living in rabbit hutches in these gigantic smart cities, or as they're now going to be, 15-minute cities. And we've lost our autonomy, and it's all awful, and we're going to have to eat insects and all of this nonsense. But the thing is, that's equally as much in my view, that is equally as much a fairy tale. That's more like the Grimm's fairy tales, which were really quite dark. But the way it works is that if you believe that there is a dystopian future, at least you believe there's a future. And you're not going to fight, because everybody's going to leave it until it's just, till it's intolerable before they turn around and fight. And I think that's what they're counting on. So you'll see, psychological operations, I think, saying, that we're all going to have to live in the metaverse, and everybody's going to be wearing their virtual reality goggles, and we won't be interacting with the real world except, through virtual reality. But the thing is, I believe that is just as much a lie as the positive, happy, clappy, green future. I believe that they're both lies, and I think what they are doing is postponing our fight to some later date. You know, everybody's going to say mañana. I'll worry about it tomorrow. I'm not going to worry about it now. I'll worry about it when they try to take my car away. But the thing is, they are building a slaughterhouse chute around us, in the form of this cashless, vaccine passport ID, climate lockdown narrative. And I think that's the next step. That's where they're going to take us. I saw a disturbing video by John Kerry's daughter, Vanessa Kerry, who's been just appointed the World Health Organization Special Envoy for Climate Change and Health. And she said, just a few moments into the video, she said, the climate crisis is a health crisis and it's killing us. Well, what her job is to inextricably link health and climate, so that now they can say that as the climate is changing, and it is changing, but it's not just changing here on Earth. There's been dramatic climate change on all of the planets in the solar system. And they're not going to tell you that when they're talking about climate change. But what they're going to do is they're going to say that the climate is now killing us, and we're destroying the climate, and the climate's killing us. Therefore, we're going to have to lock you down. And I think the measures are going to be as quick as they can probably implement them. But you're going to see taxation per mile for driving a car. You're going to see, the fuel costs shoot up. Electricity costs in the UK have more than tripled, and Germany's got it even worse. So I think that the next thing is going to be climate lockdowns, and you're going to find yourself losing your liberty really, really quickly. I think that, what's the saying, that if you've got a dog chained up in the yard and every day you take one link away from its chain until it's like this, it's not going to fight. It's not going to realize until it's too late. And I think this is what they're doing to us. So we need to get the word out. We need to tell them that climate change isn't just happening on Earth. There's been an awful lot of climate change throughout the solar system. Can I just run through quickly?
Yep, sure.
Venus's fastest winds have increased by 33% in recent years. Mars's climate is changing, and it dwarfs what's happening here on Earth. Its seismicity has been off the charts. Its rotation is speeding up, as is the Earth's. Its day is getting shorter. And we've also learned now that Mars's mantle is alive. And as Ben Davidson over at the Suspicious Observers YouTube channel says, we're pretty sure we didn't miss that before. It's a new feature. Jupiter's seeing some colossal changes. The great red spot of Jupiter, well, that's disappearing, and a brand new storm has been born, and they're calling it Red Junior. Its cloud bands mysteriously disappeared and then reappeared. And we're now seeing that its radio frequency is changing. Now, Jupiter's got a complex magnetic field that, in theory, can flip. So it's possible that the changes in its frequency emissions are caused by electrons accelerating in Jupiter's changing magnetic field. So since the nature of an electron didn't change, Jupiter's magnetic field must be changing. So there's one thing that astronomers are quite baffled by. Saturn, there's a superstorm that hits the northern hemisphere every 30 years. Well, that superstorm just came 10 years early, and it's likely due to magnetic changes on the planet, allowing more solar radiation incident on the planet, which then will trigger the storm early. Uranus has seen record storms and record aurora. It sounds familiar, doesn't it? Aurora. Neptune has a very unusual storm reversal, basically a hurricane on Neptune going the wrong way. And Pluto's no longer one of the major planets, but it lost an astonishing 20% of its atmosphere in just 2 years, which is indicative of sudden cooling. And it's possible that it's got some kind of magnetic field that is actually causing that. which may be reacting to whatever is triggering the changes in the magnetic field throughout the solar system. So, I don't ever hear climate people talking about the changes on the other planets, but it looks like Earth is simply doing the same as all the other planets. And as far as I know, we don't inhabit any of those other planets, do we?
From your perspective, do you think that there's a chance of global cooling next 30 to 40 years? Are you seeing that happening? Any ideas? Or
Yeah, well, I reached out to Professor Valentina Zarkova, and she very kindly gave me a couple of hours of the time. And she's discussed the math that she's used to predict that we're going into or could be going into a grand solar minimum. I'm quite convinced. I don't know about this solar cycle. I know that the sunspot activity is pretty much higher than anticipated, whereas she would be anticipating it to be lower. But her margin of error could be out by one solar cycle, which is, it's 11 years. So I think that, it could be that we could be going into a grand solar minimum as well, which would exacerbate the problems. If you're looking at the temperature getting much, much colder over the next few decades, you're going to need to grow food in polytunnels, heated polytunnels with artificial lighting. And given that, with the cloud cover, our solar panels probably wouldn't be performing that well, you would need fossil fuels just to grow the food. And in my conversations with Professor Zarkova, she did say that you would be looking to Africa to grow food and hopefully to be able to buy food from Africa, because we wouldn't be growing it anywhere near the amounts we need in the northern countries. So as far as I know, I can see China investing heavily in equatorial Africa. And are China going to sell us the food? I don't know. But in any case, we're going to need fossil fuels just to stay warm if it gets that bad. So that's another possibility. There's also the possibility of the Beaufort Gyre, which is this big pool of cold water up in the Arctic Ocean. If that releases into the North Atlantic, you'll get cooling all the way throughout Europe. I mean, that would be disastrous. So there's three potential disasters right there: the Grand Solar Minimum, the Beaufort Gyre, and the Carrington event. And some of these effects can actually be duplicated by their technology. For example, a nuclear high altitude detonation could generate an electromagnetic pulse that would possibly dwarf that of a Carrington event and just knock out the grid anyway. From what I understand, you'd only need 3 high altitude detonations to take out the entire grid for the United States. And that's, another scary possibility. And then, of course, you've got the solar radiation management, SRM, the alleged geoengineering, where Bill Gates has already said he wants to dim the sun. He wants to spray dust into the atmosphere, the upper atmosphere, to reduce the effects of the global warming. Well, they can simulate a grand solar minimum if that's what they're going to do. So, yeah, it's huge.
David Dubine's work, Teresa, because David Dubine, he's got a website called Adapt 2030, and he's been talking about the grand solar minimum for quite a long time, and he's in the States, and he did come over to England and talk about it with peers years ago at the Alternative View conferences in London.
But he's called it the astrophysicist.
Yeah. He did a few talks with Piers Corbyn, but Piers is quite skeptical about all of this. He said it's not something to worry about. I don't think he's really looking at it closely enough at the moment, because he got involved with mayoral campaigns and what have you. I don't know, but he's not as enthusiastic about it as Valentina is, or David Dubine for that matter. David Dubine he used to work in commodities, particularly coffee, and he found that all his coffee plantations that his company were running in I think it was Borneo in Burma, Myanmar, they found that they were having to grow the coffee under polytunnels, and then they had to do double-skinned polytunnels because we're going back, 8-9 years ago, because the temperature dropped so drastically in Myanmar. So he started his work then, and he's now got his own. I think he's got land now in Nebraska somewhere where he's doing growing projects under polytunnels. Yeah, because of he's absolutely clear that there is a ground solar minimum coming.
So, Teresa, have you looked into just the danger of I looked it up, the volcanic winter of 536 or the 1816 year without a summer? Can we predict at all when that would happen next, or how often does that happen long term?
I have looked into it briefly, but I've fallen down the rabbit hole of catastrophism. It's really quite fascinating. I mean, you've got, going back through the last century, you've got Cuvier's floods, Charles Hapgood's shifting crust theory, Velikovsky, who reckoned that the Earth was being hit with fragments of planets. Douglas Vogt, who said that he's passed away now. He said that the sun novas micronovas every 12,000 years. Ben Davidson over at Suspicious Observers, he's talking about the pole flip. Chan Thomas, that's an interesting one. The Adam and Eve story that apparently was classified by the CIA, in which he describes the Earth's crust displacing following, some kind of impetus that would actually unlock the Earth's crust from the mantle. So there's a whole big field there of catastrophism, and I think it would be fantastic if you got some of these guys on to talk about their particular flavor of catastrophism, because there are many. Some people believe that the pole flip is going to be triggered by a solar micronova, or that it's coinciding with the arrival of something called the galactic current sheet, which is like an electrostatically charged belt of dust that hits us every 12,000 years, emanating from a Parker spiral around the center of our galaxy. It's really fascinating stuff. Some people believe that there's going to be an exoplanet flyby, so that will actually trigger the Earth's magnetic poles to flip.
What was an exoplanet flyby?
Well, some people believe that there's a Planet 9, and that Planet 9 is actually out in some far, flung orbit that eventually now and then comes.
Oh, is that Planet X, like Nibiru? Is that Planet X?
Yeah, they call it Nibiru, or the exoplanet, or the dwarf sun, or whatever. There's a whole bunch of theories like that, and there's definitely geological evidence going back through the years showing that the Earth has got a cyclical disaster series, notably every 12,000 years. But there appears to be a 6,000-year cycle and a 3,000-year cycle. So it seems to come in harmonics. But certainly the whatever's triggering these big volcanic eruptions, I mean, it could be just that it's the plates shifting around. If you believe that, some people believe that the Earth is expanding or growing. There's a whole bunch of theories out there, but the one that really grabs me at the moment is the Janibekov effect. There was an cosmonaut on a Soviet space station in the 1980s, and he was spinning a wingnut off some supplies, and as the wingnut spun off the nut that was securing the supplies, and it entered microgravity spinning, he noticed that every few seconds it would flip. And it turns out that there's, if you look at the physics of it, it's also called the tennis racket theorem. And it basically says that any object that has three moments of inertia, three different separate axes about which that it can spin, it will be stable in numbers 1 and 3, but it will be unstable in number 2. Now, what Janibekov did, which was quite funny, was having noticed this, he got a big lump of modeling clay and he built a model of the Earth, and he stuck his wing nut into it, and then threaded it back on, and then unthreaded it. And what he found was that this model of the Earth out of plasticine or modeling clay, it flipped periodically every few seconds. So the Russian, the USSR government said, right, okay, we'll classify that. And it was classified for a decade, which is really interesting. Now, one YouTube channel, Verisatum, Very something. I'll get you the link if you want it. The guy on there did a really great show. It's about 15 minutes long, talking about this. And he concluded that it can't happen. But there is another guy who is an engineer who's been using some very sophisticated computer modeling. And he's managed to do a model for the Earth using the difference in the gravitational field at different points on the Earth as kind of introducing a anomalous sort of like balance or weight for the Earth. And he reckons that the Earth is actually subject to the Janibekov effect. So in other words, the Earth can just by itself flip rotation maybe every few thousand years. So that's a part of catastrophism that I'm just discovering now. It's really fascinating. You don't need an exoplanet flying by the Earth. You don't need a solar micronova to blast one side of the Earth and trigger the crust to displace. Proponents of that theory say that the weight, once the crust is now free to move, the weight of ice on Greenland and on Antarctica will want to rotate at the equator. So you'll see a 90-degree displacement of the Earth's crust, which, if that was to happen in the next few decades, it would explain the Antarctic Treaty and why the United Nations has as its emblem the polar view, the North Polar view of the Earth, and the Antarctic Treaty has as its emblem Antarctica, because if this happens and the Earth's crust does slip through 90 degrees, as well as seeing, you'd see mile-high tsunamis, you'd see hundreds of miles an hour winds as the air and the water continue to rotate in the direction that they were going, but the crust moves. So you would see most of the continents inundated, but Antarctica and its rich resources, which we know that there's massive resources of coal in Antarctica, but also probably oil. That will be prime real estate, because that will be revolving at the equator, possibly by the mid-2050s, mid-2060s. So it all remains to be explored, and it's fascinating. And I've been doing this ever since I first discovered it. So I think catastrophe.
Why the Nazis were so interested in Antarctica?
Oh gosh, yes.
Yeah. Well, yeah.
I think so. The United States government was. In fact, there was a guy by the name of Hamish Harding. He was a billionaire, and he went on a trip to where was it? Yeah, it was the North Pole, I think. With
didn't he die in that
strangely enough? Yes, he did. But he went on a trip with Buzz Aldrin, who's always been a bit of a bit of a maverick, hasn't he? I don't think he even really believes his own moon landings. But Hamish Harding went on a trip to the North Pole, which would indicate that he might possibly have known about a potential pole shift. He also circumnavigated the Earth in a plane, specially modified to break the world record for a polar circumnavigation of the Earth. And he went on that with a former commander of the International Space Station, so another astronaut. And then he decided he was going to go up in one of Jeff Bezos's flights of the Blue Origin. So he became an astronaut. And then, for some reason, I don't know, but for some reason, he ended up on this ill-fated Titan submarine.
Submarine thing, yeah.
Yeah, and if he did know about the pole shift, he's not around to talk about it now, which is sad, really. But yeah, he seemed to be in all the right places at the right time. And in fact, I've written a Substack about that. Even his children tried to get power of attorney over him because they believed that he was believing weird conspiracy theories. So it's entirely possible that he pretty much was looking into the field of catastrophism and whether or not we could be seeing a pole shift in our lifetime.
So do you, Teresa, do you have a number one theory as to what's causing the magnetic fields to change on other planets? Is it what you're talking about with the wing nut and all that? Or is it too complicated to try to figure out what is causing those?
At the moment, it's really complicated, which is why I'm reaching out to astrophysicists like Dr. Willie Soon. He's been very kind and given me a few moments of his time to give me some information to go and look at. I'm trying to piece it all together. I've already come up with the theory that I haven't seen anywhere else, that the goals of United Nations Agenda 21, Agenda 2030 are to set us up to fail a Carrington event. It's not about control. They don't want control of 8 billion useless eaters. They want the resources, and they want us gone. So I believe that that's the plan, and they're just going to leverage nature to do it. I don't know. I like the solar micronova idea. I know that the Apollo 17 mission, the astronauts there's an interesting clip where you can see them lifting up rocks and looking for glass beading, which would be something that you would probably find if the sun does micronova on a regular basis. Now, I know that some people are tracking micronovas in our galaxy. They found that the stars in a direct line between us and the galactic core seem to be going micronova now. Barnard's star, AD Leo, Proxima Centauri, they've all gone micronova. And it looks like we are next in line. So is it possible that the whole purpose of the Apollo missions was to go up to space and see if they could, up to the moon, and see if they could find evidence that the sun does something terrible every 12,000 years? I don't know. But if it did, you wouldn't find that proof here on Earth, because you'd be looking for something very, very particular, and the biosphere would cover that over. So they'd want to be going to the moon to look for that. And I think that this renewed interest in the moon, particularly with Elon Musk and the NASA mission that's upcoming, Jeff Bezos, Richard Branson, all these billionaires just seem to be really interested in getting into orbit. But I don't think they'd be safe in orbit during a Carrington event. I think they would probably, if they were going to go and hide somewhere, they'd probably want to be behind the moon, because there's no magnetic field on the moon. So there would be no jolt that would take out their systems. You know, Elon Musk lost 40 satellites in 2022, launching straight into a solar storm. So I got my doubts about that guy. If you look at his companies, SpaceX, well, that's about escaping into orbit. Starlink, well, that's all about the control grid. The Boring Company, bunkers? Is he wanting to go bunkers? Neuralink, well, you could potentially back yourself up onto solid state. Perhaps he's looking at immortality there. Tesla, well, you'd want that technology if you're going to rebuild post-apocalypse. And Twitter. Why did he buy Twitter? Is that to monitor the resistance? Is that to control the narrative? Why did he buy Twitter? It seems so strange. But his 6 companies, just looking at them, it seems to me that he's expecting something really big to happen. And he wants those technologies. He wants those capabilities. So it's really fascinating. By the way, I don't believe he's going to Mars at all. Mars does not really have a magnetic field, not like the Earth does. So any of his colonists would probably have a very miserable life. You've got virtually no protection from solar and cosmic radiation. So I think that's a big fat lie, to be honest.
Do you see Musk as an absolute genius, or his genius is overrated, or no?
No, I think he's had just as much help as Bill Gates. I think these people are just the front men for these big faceless organizations that are, plotting against us with their little Machiavellian machinations. I think these guys are just front men. I don't think there's any genius there with Musk. He's done some pretty dumb things. With regards to theories about why Earth's magnetic field is collapsing, there was an interesting paper published last year, and it was covered on CNN, Euronews, globally, that a team of scientists have found that the Earth's inner core has stopped rotating relative to the outer core. So they are now rotating in synchronicity. And if you go on Wikipedia, Simple English, not the more complicated one, but if you go on Simple English, I don't think they expect most people to read that. The first few paragraphs tell you that Earth's magnetic field is thought to be generated by the relative rotation of the inner core and the outer core. It causes convection currents, which generates an electric field, which generates a magnetic field. And this causes the Earth to have this marvelous magnetic field that protects us from solar and cosmic radiation. Now, it stands to reason that if Earth's inner core is no longer rotating is no longer rotating relative to the outer core, that the Earth's magnetic field will be affected. And I think this is what we're starting to see. But as regards what happens to cause these two elements of the core to stop rotating together, I don't know. I need to do more reading, more research. But I think it's very interesting. I think it's probably explaining what's happening, and it could very well be tied into what I described earlier, which was the Janibekov effect, which is the ability of a rotating body to spontaneously flip to and fro. So I'd say that could be something to do with it.
I think we've covered just about everything. I still think that I'm a bit more optimistic than you, Teresa. I have to be. I think all of this is possible, and I think perhaps they are accelerating it because they know stuff. I'm pretty sure of that, but I still believe that we will get through this somehow. I don't know how, but I do believe that. I have to.
Okay, I guess we'll wrap up there. This has been very interesting for me. Sandi Adams, Teresa Tannahill, thank you for your time, and hopefully we can do it again.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Tom.
All right, talk to you later.
Thank you, Tom.